Well, good morning, everyone. I'm David Gross and with Undersecretary Kathy Novelli. I'm not going to begin by a long bio presentation because we want to get right to the substance. But let me just mention one thing that is really not in the bio materials that have been distributed about the Undersecretary. Uh, I've been lucky to have known a good number of undersecretaries of economics and business affairs, et cetera, over the years. And Undersecretary Novelli is truly remarkable in a number of respects. But for purposes of today, one of the things that makes her particularly remarkable is she's really the first Undersecretary of State who is a native speaker about digital life and digital issues. And that, I think, is extraordinarily important because it really shades how the most senior parts of the U.S. government look at these issues. And we're just thrilled to have the Undersecretary with us today. Undersecretary, one of the reasons I say that you have had such a will have had such a lasting impact on these issues is Global Connect, something I know that's near and dear to your heart. Can you talk a little bit about how you see Global Connect, what it is, the impact it has, and the lasting nature you think it will have globally?
Okay. Well, thanks. And thanks for that great introduction. And yeah, Global Connect actually grew out of looking at all of these questions about digital empowerment and what does that mean, and economic growth, and all these different parts of the portfolio I have. And it grew out of looking at the World Bank study that showed that for every 10% increase in connectivity, there's a 1 to 2 percentage point increase in GDP in a developing country. And when you look at that, you think, okay, we spend all this time on all of these projects to help aid development, which are great. And here you have this correlation with the internet, which is, to me, is the 21st century infrastructure. And um, and so then we looked at, well, wow, there's this tool. What do we need to really, what can we do to be a catalyst? Because we know that we still have over 4 billion people who aren't connected to the internet at all. And what's the power of that if we can actually help be a catalyst? And there's a lot of things going on, not just that the United States is doing, but other developed countries are doing, the private sector is doing, some multilateral development banks, and the IDB being one of the most progressive, are doing. And so we pulled together this initiative, Global Connect, with in a typical business sense, with some sort of metric that we can measure. And we didn't decide that we were going to connect everybody in the world because that seemed a little bit pie in the sky. So we picked 1.5 billion people by 2020, which we think is totally doable. And the idea is that countries have signed on to support this, and we have 60 or more countries having signed on, many in Latin America. Some of them are countries that are really quite far ahead, as Carlos was saying, like Colombia, like Chile, and even Argentina. And some, have a ways to go. But we also wanted to be a catalyst for how does this all get financed, and understanding that part of financing for these big projects is going to come from governments, some is going to come from the private sector, and some is going to come from the multilateral development banks. The multilateral development banks, I would say, with the exception of the IDB, who's been very forward leaning, really have not stepped up. If you think about this as modern day infrastructure, and then you look at how much is being spent, it's like less than 1% of the financing of the multilateral development banks is going on for connectivity. So we really wanted to kind of say, well, look at if you're a development bank, you need to be putting this into your lexicon, and you need to be thinking about, as you're building a road, can you do a dig once policy? Are there things that can happen? And we've concentrated on connectivity, and connectivity has several aspects to it. One of them is, of course, just physically being connected. But then once you're connected, you have to be able to use the internet. And so that means you have to be able to afford it. You have to have content that, is going to allow you to really access it. So we're sort of looking at all those prongs and understanding that the private sector is going to be the real innovators here, but also understanding that the purse strings for this in an individual country are finance ministers. And that's why we pulled together this big conference here in April at the World Bank, because it was on the margins of the Bank Fund meeting, and we wanted finance ministers to hear this story, because we know that communications ministers and people who work in this area, they get the power of the internet. They get that the internet, if you give that to a person, they can, they can have better education, they can have better access to healthcare, they can access global markets. I met these amazing women who were doing handicrafts, wool handicrafts in the middle of the Amazon. And they, are proudly giving me their card with their website. And, they said they have a whole fair trade thing. They've got all these women. They sell stuff all over the world. They could never do that without the internet. So, it is such a powerful tool. And finance ministers have to decide what they're going to spend money on in their own country. And, communications ministers aren't always the most powerful, frankly, in the hierarchy of the food chain. So we wanted to start spreading this out at a different level and have a different conversation. So that's sorry to go on and on here, but that's sort of the gestalt of this whole thing. The idea being that we're a catalyst. We're bringing everybody to start looking at this and focusing on it. And just like the internet is a web of all kinds of different activity, Global Connect is a web too. It's not something that we're going to do by ourselves as the U.S. government.
But you talk about the challenges of getting the message out to the decision makers in various countries. So I was struck here in the United States, you have an executive order from the president, which is about as big a thing as you can have here in Washington. How's it going having these conversations with other leaders, finance ministers, prime ministers, presidents, particularly in the Americas, but generally? And if I could, particularly in the context of every day we hear about problems on the internet, cybercrime, cybersecurity, and so forth. How do these pieces fit together? We've talked about economic development, social development, but we have these other challenges as well. How does that affect your conversations?
Well, so just unpack the first part of your question and how are these conversations going. One of the greatest things about this executive order is that we now have a whole of government approach to this. So it's not just the State Department out there talking to, ministers and the private sector, but we have the Treasury Department, we have AID, we have the Commerce Department, we have the MCC. So we have all these and many others, all OPIC, all together in a room saying, what are you doing to further this whole goal of 1.5 billion people connected? And how do we leverage off each other so that we're all working together? And that is a hugely powerful thing. When you can get the US government, all these agencies rowing the boat in the same direction. So that has been fantastic. And I think, that has allowed us to have many disparate conversations, but with all of us on the same page. And we have gotten incredible receptivity. And I think, people's eyes just actually go wide when they hear those World Bank statistics, because everybody wants their country to develop. Everybody wants their people to have better access to medicine, to education, to markets, to empower entrepreneurs. There's nothing about this that's a problem in terms of connectivity. You're right that there are absolutely challenges, and those have to be addressed. And those, I think, tend to be not addressed by finance ministers and multilateral development banks, et cetera, but in the more technical sort of realm. And what I would say is those have to be addressed. We have to look at that, but that shouldn't and doesn't stop our efforts to make sure that the benefits of connectivity are still going to be spread out.
So looking ahead, it seems clear to me at least that now that we're at the end of an administration, one of the keys for any administration as it comes to its end after 8 years is what is its legacy? Clearly, I think Global Connect stands out as a legacy for not just for the State Department, but as you point out, for the administration writ large. How do you try to work to institutionalize that going forward, no matter who the next administration is?
Yeah. So that's why we have an executive order that sort of sets up, a committee, if you will, that has to meet and has to do reports about how are we progressing. The first one of those is due at the end of this year, but that will continue on. What's great about this is that there's complete bipartisan support in Congress. There have been bills in Congress that have passed both houses saying do Global Connect. This is a really good thing. So I am not super worried about it continuing because it's such a great thing, and it's really, to me, it's also, we have been very fortunate in the United States to have kind of been the first mover, if you will, on the internet, in terms of it really spreading out, and so to be able to sort of have that expertise and that and to be a catalyst in that way, I think is only a positive for the country, and people recognize that. So I can't predict what the next administration will do, but it is a bipartisan supported thing. So I'm hopeful.
Terrific. And as you look south towards the Americas and so forth, how important are these issues in those relationships, and both from an economic perspective and also from a geopolitical perspective, both in terms of countries for whom we have very close historic relationships, but also countries like Cuba and others where we've had a much rockier and difficult, the issue of internet freedom, the issue of economic development. How do you see these pieces working?
So, we are actively working in the region. Argentina actually signed up to be the first Global Connect focus country, which is fantastic in the region. And Argentina actually has a pretty high level of connectivity already. So you may say, well, why Argentina? But to me, that just shows their own foresight in saying, well, but we have these regions that are underserved. Can you help with that? The IDB is doing things. We're looking at what we can do ourselves through aid projects or others. The FCC is going to engage on how do you make sure your regulatory policy keeps things healthy. So I think this gives us a point of interaction in the region that is just wholly constructive. And the truth is that sometimes some of our relationships with some countries have been more fraught than with others. This is our own region together, all of us, and it's in all of our interest to make sure that everybody's tide rises. And so that's, to me, this is a completely positive point of engagement, something we're highlighting in all of our economic dialogues. And then there are specific digital dialogues that have gone on and will continue to go on and are being developed throughout the region. I think what's great, though, is that we've been able to take this to a higher level and show its value beyond just that narrow world.
You've talked about a number of the meetings, both multilateral, bilateral meetings with governments and so forth. IEEE has been very actively involved in this and has hosted meetings. We'll host another one coming up, and so forth. So as you look at this tapestry of players out there, beyond governments that we've really focused on, how do you see industry and other players playing in this space? And particularly, obviously, Telefonica has been very active in this area, but we have representatives from other companies in the audience. How do you see this playing out going forward?
Well, so the industry is absolutely crucial. This can't happen without the industry, and the industry is the one who's been innovating. And that's going to continue. And I think that's why I say, we're just kind of a catalyst, because the innovation is going to come from the industry and the implementation is going to come from the industry. I mean, they're the ones who are going to be actually providing the services in the end of the day. And so I think, this is really a big partnership. And the fact that IEEE has wanted to be involved is just fantastic, because it's not just then policymakers, but it's also engineers who actually know how to get these things done and can look at what are creative solutions and understand one size doesn't always fit all. So, they're actually breaking things down in typical engineering fashion to, we should look at regions, we should look at countries and sort of see what is really needed there. And so, sort of identifying that. So I just think it's a wonderful, if it's not a perfectly controlled kind of environment, which makes people who are used to traditional government initiatives very nervous. But to me, it reflects the internet, and that's what really needs to happen.
But you have a background not only in government but also in industry and so forth. As we move into, and I realize we're running out of time here, but as we move into Internet of Things world, the 5G world, and so forth, and the massive investments that people talk about, not only in the United States but globally.
Right.
How do you see the investment incentives part of Global Connect? How does that play? How important is it? How do you see those types of challenges being met?
Well, so to me, and this is something, I guess I learned in the private sector, but maybe instinctively knew, none of these things are going to continue unless they're economically viable, right? And so everything needs to be set up in a way that it can be taken forward by the private sector as something that's going to make money. And that's what makes everything flow. So, the Internet of Things is like this, is sort of the next frontier, or maybe the frontier's already here. But, there's going to be an explosion of that. And what I think is fantastic about that is that the ability for entrepreneurial input into that is going to be immense. And when you see the web of entrepreneurs in this hemisphere, it is so inspiring. And everywhere I go, I visit, tech hubs, and they're just full of, in this region, full of people with amazing ideas and business plans that they are executing. And so I feel like we as a region are very well poised to take advantage of this.
One last question, and maybe we'll have a moment to have questions from
Sure,
the
of
floor
course.
if you have a few extra moments. I was struck by one of the three pillars of the Telefonica Digital Life includes internet freedom.
Mhm.
I know that internet freedom is something close to your heart and something that you worked very, very long and hard on. Today is hopefully the day of the IANA transition. We will see, as long as there's courts don't stop it, we will see what happens there. Can you just talk a little bit, the economic importance of the internet and even the cultural is pretty clear to a lot of people, but I think people often don't appreciate the internet freedom and that class of issues and its relationship to human development. Can you talk a little bit about how you see those interplays happening?
Yes, and I think I would say, to me, internet freedom is about what you would think it is, which is, can people access information? Can they provide information freely? And that is a vital aspect of people's participation in their own lives and in their own, how they're governed, etc. There's another aspect that I think of when I think of internet freedom, which is, we're all amassing a lot of like aggregated data, big data, and the ability to use that for good, for diagnosing, medicine, for business to work in a multilateral way, to look at how can we use that to develop agricultural practices where you use less water, or fishing practices where you actually are much more precise about what you're doing about catching fish, etc. I think there is the incredible use, and to me, that's part of internet freedom also, but not one that we think about. It is something that gets under challenge because there's the privacy aspect of that, critically important aspect of it. And I think that's something that we all as societies are going to have to continue to find a path forward so that we protect the privacy of individuals, we protect the ability of individuals to speak their mind and have access to information. And at the same time, we are able to garner the benefits of all of this data that we now have access to that we didn't before that we can use for problem solving.
Perfect. Let me open up for any questions that the audience may have for the Undersecretary. Oh, we have one over here. If you could also identify, since I know who you are, but maybe others don't.
Hi, I'm Tricia Paoletta. I'm at Harris, Wiltshire, and Grannis. And thank you for joining us, Undersecretary and Mr. Ambassador. This is a little far afield, but to realize the potential of 5G, IoT, we need internationally harmonized spectrum, right? That will promote economies of scale, certainly consistent with the goals of Global Connect. The Organization of American States, the Committee on International Telecommunications, CTEL, was vitally important for that goal of international harmonized spectrum, and very important for the U.S. industry to promote its views of harmonization. They seem to be underfunded. Many of the countries of Latin America, facing economic challenges, have not, met their goals of support. Is State Department doing anything to help promote the cause of CTEL and to make sure it's viable going forward as we enter a new cycle of trying to promote internationally harmonized spectrum for 5G?
Well, CTEL's a fantastic organization. I am not intimately familiar with the funding of it, but certainly we completely support it and understand how important it is. So if there's a problem of funding, then that's certainly something we should be looking at as appropriate for us, because CTEL, I think, has been a place of great consonance of views, and being able to bring that internationally forward has been extremely important in terms of globally ending up in the right place. So we want to make sure that CTEL is strong.
One thing that proves that some things change and other things don't. Funding issues with CTEL seems to be one of those that never changes. It's always a great challenge, even though it does, obviously, as you point out, Undersecretary, incredibly important work for all of us. Well, we are beyond the amount of time that the Undersecretary had graciously given us for this morning. I think she deserves a tremendous round of applause.